In this era of grave spiritual crisis, it is not enough to simply know about your Catholic faith. That is why we need a Catholic toolbox to equip us with the practical skills necessary to live our Catholic faith to reach our ultimate goal, which is heaven for all eternity. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Join us every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. for the Catholic Toolbox as we hand you the tools to go forth, live the faith, and change our modern world today. Live on the Voice of Charity. And welcome back to another week on the Catholic Toolbox, the Art of Practical Catholicism. I'm your host and founder, George Manassa, here as we equip you with practical tools to live your Catholic faith in our modern world of today. And especially this week, we're going east. We're heading east this week to the Eastern Catholic churches. But before we go into that, if you haven't checked out our website, go to thecatholictoolboxshow.com. That is thecatholictoolboxshow.com. And before we go straight into it, I want to introduce my guest here this week, Anthony Cleary. Welcome aboard to the Catholic Toolbox.
Yeah, thank you, George. Thanks very much. And it's a great pleasure to be with you. And congratulations to you and the work that you're doing and the different guests that you've had each week. Because I think as you said in your introduction, we're at a time when we need some practical understandings about the application of our faith. St. Anselm said a very long time ago about the definition of theology about faith-seeking understanding. And I don't just think it's our understanding, it's also our actual living out of that faith and our giving witness to it.
Exactly. And especially as James chapter 1 verse 22 says, we have to take action with our faith. And that's what we're about here on the Catholic Toolbox. I'm delighted that you're here on the show. My first encounter with you actually is very interesting. When I was in year 10, you didn't know me back then, but I went to one of your talks at the Guardians program at St. Charbel's in Punchbowl. I used to, when I had, after my reversion back to the faith in year 9, in grade 9, I was studying my way back into the Catholic faith, you know, a little bit ahead of, I was a little bit ahead of my age. I went to a talk, I remember, that you gave about the Eastern churches back in 2010. I don't know if you recall the exact one there, but that was a great talk, and it really struck me. And that's where I really started learning about the different rites. And interestingly enough, it's great because it comes in somebody, you yourself are not part of the Eastern Catholic. You're not born an Eastern Catholic. You're a Western Catholic giving a talk about that topic. But before we go, before we get sidelined, I'm really excited here tonight to talk about it. It's one of my favorite topics to discuss. What are the Eastern Catholic churches, Anthony? Simply put, what are they? Because people get those experiences where they meet a Maronite, they meet a Melkite or a Ukrainian Catholic, and they ask the question in the West, are you Catholic? Is this Catholic? I remember I remember telling my mum about a month ago, and even my in-laws, actually, interestingly, that we've been, attending the Anglican ordinariate, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, you're going to the Anglican church. It's this concept of different rites, one faith, but you can express it in different rites. But we're focusing here on the Eastern Catholic churches. So what is an Eastern Catholic church?
Well, I suppose I would start off by saying that each Sunday around the world, over 1 billion people profess a belief in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And that profession of faith means different things to different people. But it's the creed which, of course, draws people together. And our understanding is that there is a diversity in the unity of the Catholic Church. And properly understood, the Catholic Church today is 22 sister churches, and 21 of those churches are Eastern. Now, if you were to, when we take the term Eastern and Western, it actually goes back to the Roman Empire, when the Roman Emperor Diocletian in 285 actually divided the Roman Empire because it was so vast. And he acknowledged that the management of the Roman Empire was impossible to do. And so he split the empire into two parts. Now, in those first few centuries after Christ, Christianity had spread to different parts of the Roman Empire. It had originated in Jerusalem, but in Alexandria, in Rome, in Constantinople, as far as India as well. The Apostle Thomas went. And so you had these major, Antioch again, you had these major cities which became centers and then actually became the patriarchates of the Catholic Church in its early years. So all the modern Eastern Catholic churches are basically those churches which were geographically in the eastern part of the Roman Empire at that time. And so the Western Church, which was the Latin Church, because Latin was the language of the Church of Rome, basically was in the western part of Europe, and the rest of the Eastern Catholic churches were in North Africa, today's Middle East, and even the Far East to India. And so it actually is a fascinating thing. So you have 21 very different churches within that, because again, if you were to say that there are similarities between the Eastern churches, yes, there are, but there are actually great differences as well. There are differences of culture. There are differences of theologically. Generally, they are all under the same umbrella, but it's where you have the liturgical and sacramental life of those churches, the aspects of ritual, some of the what we would call traditional living out of the faith that we associate, that we call the Byzantine churches.
Yep.
Which are associated, and so the Melkites as a Byzantine church. We have the sacraments of initiation all take place when the child is an infant. And so, whereas, for example, with the Maronites, it's only two of the sacraments, baptism and chrismation, or we would say confirmation in the Roman Catholic Church. So the Eastern churches also have a great diversity in them. And I think that we are drawn to that understanding that no single vision can ever exhaust the riches of the mystery of God. of the expression of faith within those particular churches. And they have grown and they have flourished differently, of course, because of the parts of the world that they are in.
Are you with us? You're still with us here. I think your connection slowed down a little bit before.
Yes,
yep, you're back. Yes, excellent.
And that was one of the disadvantages of me moving from my study to my lounge area. The lights went out, but that's where the internet is based. So we'll see how we go. And one thing, George, I will provide to you to provide to your audiences and your listeners. I have a number of well presented, I believe, PowerPoints which explain this too, and actually give what the map of the Roman Empire looked like, even, and where those particular early churches were.
Excellent. And it's very interesting because many people think that they might see a different liturgy, they might see a different church, and they might automatically think, oh, is this Catholic? But what does it mean? Let's discuss a little bit. What does it mean to be Catholic? What makes you Catholic, essentially? Is it simply our faith, or is it practice, or what makes us all Catholic and have the same faith, same baptism, same Lord that's common between all rites?
Well, again, and it's what you've said there. It's that we are drawn together with an understanding that our understanding of the sacraments, our theological understanding of the sacraments, our profession of faith in the creed. And so what you see is that theologically, there are no variances there in terms of it's where the life of a Catholic is born out and is shaped by that relationship with Christ, and again strengthened through the sacraments. And it's the beliefs that the person actually holds. And so it's the variances occur within, for example, the liturgy. And so but the actual, now one example would be, if you were to look at many of the liturgies within the a Roman Catholic liturgy in the Eucharistic prayer, Roman Catholics typically kneel within the Eucharistic prayer. And whereas the majority of the Eastern Catholics believe that it is unnecessary to kneel. And so they actually stand, and they see that the standing, and so that actual practice indicates just a slight variance of, but it's the belief in, so when you, and it goes back to George, so what does it mean to be a Catholic today? It's our belief about, Jesus Christ, Son of God and Son of Mary, and, the concept of our belief in original sin, our belief in Jesus, our belief in the resurrection, our belief in redemption, our belief, for example, in practical terms of transubstantiation. So you could actually go through about the core elements of what it means to be Catholic on a whole range of fronts, and they really are fundamentally pulled together in the 4 parts of the Catechism, which is where we have that broader sort of blueprint for the beliefs and practices of being a Catholic today, because I think that's the significant thing is that following the commandments is one thing, but why is that following the commandments the whole so essential? And it's about, the notion of the moral law, but it's an acceptance also of those things that we deem to be at the core of church teaching in and around, for example, Mary. Often, if you were to say what are three things that separate Catholics from other Christians, it would be the Eucharist, the Pope, and Mary are three things which are reasonably distinctive. And for example, while Orthodox share the same views about the Eucharist, they clearly have different views in part about Mary and certainly about the Pope. So it's about looking for and identifying the things that make us Catholic today. And even from a practical point of view, but this, of course, is shared by other people who are not Catholic, not even Christian at times, is our whole understanding of, we believe, for example, that we're made in the image and likeness of God and that life is sacred from conception.
So basically what you're trying to say is, this is the way I like to see it. Jesus Christ established one true church, his body, and that's the church outside which there is no salvation. Now, as that's one church which developed in Jerusalem, went out to different parts of the world, naturally, the beliefs are the same, the dogmas are the same of any tradition within the Catholic Church to be Catholic. It's the same faith, same baptism, same Lord, you're in the church. But the expression of the way they celebrate the Eucharist with the same theology in every single distinct liturgy is culturally different or ritualistically different or emphasizes different aspects of theology.
Yeah, and look, and sometimes I would say the cultural expressions of the faith can be on matters which some hold to be really important. For example, like in the Western Church, you have the notion of a celibate priesthood, whereas in many of the Eastern churches, the requirement of priests, you have married priests, and for example, their episcopacy is not, they are not married, and you still have monks who are not married. And again, the man must be married before he becomes a priest, can't become the priest and then married. And so there are certain structures for that. So, but like as you would know, as a young man who follows theological discussions fairly closely, a lot of people say, oh, that is a defining factor of what it means to be Catholic. Well, actually, no, it's not. It's important within the Latin Church, and it is a particular discipline, and it has a particular history to it. There wasn't always mandatory celibacy for the clergy of the Western Church. It was something that came in over time. And whereas for the Eastern churches, yet at the same time, one of the controversial points that needs to also be looked at is, and this is about our understanding of the Eastern churches, in many parts of the world, Eastern churches, and this included even in Australia, Eastern bishops were not permitted to ordain married men in Western nations, and in some countries, and it caused a lot of problems, especially in the United States with Ruthenian Catholics. It caused some issues here. Yet we know now in Australia that many of the Eastern churches here in Australia have married clergy. And that is a cultural expression of that which is at the core of that church, which goes back to the very origins of those churches, and they've continued it in time. But it shows how there have been times when those natural expressions of those churches have suffered or been compromised by what's considered to be the more dominant church. Because when we consider it, the Western church or the Latin church would be approximately 95%, probably closer to 98% of Catholics are Western Catholic or Latin Catholic.
Most of the Catholic Church, most of the faithful in the church belong to the West.
That's correct. Yeah. And again, there is a reason for that. And it's a really practical reason for that. That when you look at a map and you look at where the West was, where the Western Church, the Church of Rome was, when Diocletian divided the empire, the Western Church, the Latin Church, was of course in Rome. It was in Spain, in France, in England, in Portugal. It was in the empire nations. It was in the nations that would go out and colonize the rest of the world. Whereas the Eastern Catholic churches were in North Africa, they were in the Middle East, they were in Eastern Europe. And so the Eastern churches suffered, of course, because of the division, two divisions, 451 and 1054. And so those two splits caused great havoc for the Eastern churches.
So if we do look at it, if you think of Spain, for example, Spain colonized basically South America, the Philippines. So that's the reason why when Catholicism came to those countries, they naturally received the expression of the Catholic faith in the Western way. Had it been, for instance, the Maronites who colonized South America, they would have been Catholics practicing the Maronite rite or any other Eastern rite. So is that correct?
Well, and so what you're saying is correct. So from their origins, they were affected. They were damaged greatly by the splits with the Oriental Orthodox and then the Great Schism. So that damaged them. And we have to remember today that when we talk about, I'll come back to this, but when we talk about Eastern churches, most Christians don't think of the Catholics. They think of the Orthodox.
Okay.
Because they are also referred to as the Oriental or the Orthodox church, as the churches of the East.
Yeah, and that might be getting more of a complicated. So just to step back a little bit for all our listeners.
Yeah.
So we have one church that Jesus established, and then obviously as it expanded, it went to Eastern Europe. Naturally, they would express the faith and carry out their liturgy in an Eastern way. Because it was in the West, they developed the Roman liturgy and all its thing. But let's quickly go through let's list some of the rites. I know we can maybe get this graphic up here for our listeners to look at. Let's look at some of these rites. Like I said, there's the Western Church and the Eastern Church. The Western
I suppose, George, I would only say one thing to you. When we refer to rite, I would prefer to refer to them as suris or church, because rite, in a strict sense, is really also looking primarily at the liturgical aspect of it. So if we look at the Eastern churches, and then you've got the ones, for example, like you've got the Coptics in North Africa, then you've got. And then you move across, so you had the city of Alexandria in North Africa, where, again, you had primarily, the Coptics were the very big one. Around Antioch, again, you had the Maronites, you had Syriacs. So you had a whole group of very small, splintered communities.
You could call them ethno
And
groups, essentially.
Sorry?
That were basically you could call them ethno groups. It was just a community of ethnic people.
Yeah, no, look, and that's probably a good way of referring to them. But Antioch had the greatest number. See, what was tragic is that when you looked at the patriarchate cities, the very original city, of course, that of Jerusalem, was destroyed in 70 AD, and you had the first destruction of it right through to between 70 and Christian persecutions between 70 and 130 AD. You had this terrible destruction of the Christian communities there in Jerusalem. And that then meant that early church community in Jerusalem really suffered and never actually took off. So the very origins of the church that Christ had established never flourished in Jerusalem. You then had, so around with Antioch, you had the Syrians, and that's where often many people will refer to like the whole notion of language comes into this, and Syriac was, of course, the dominant language of Antioch. And then even the complication with that is East and West Syriac as well. But you had there...
and for those listening, Syriac, for those who aren't familiar with Syriac, it's basically Aramaic, form of Aramaic, which is the language that Jesus spoke.
That's correct. So what it is it's a... I'm just trying to move it because I've got a little blowfly moving around. So I'm just trying to have it so that it's sort of buzzing in and around near where this screen was. But so you've got, you had with Antioch, you had a whole group of smaller churches. Your biggest church is the Byzantine church, or the Church of Constantinople. And again, the ones and what grew out of there is you had Russian, you had
Ukrainian,
Melkite, Albanian. And so you've got a whole range of churches that
different churches with their own identity, their own serious identity. So you have the Byzantine, they use the Byzantine liturgy.
That's correct.
But they all have, let's say, the Russian Catholics will do that same liturgy, but in Russian. The Melkites will do it in Arabic. The Albanians will do it in Albanian. The Ukrainian Catholics, a beautiful church in Lidcombe, actually, will do it in Ukrainian, unless it's English. But they have their own sort of style of doing it. But they're their own self-governing churches.
And that's where you would technically say the Ukrainian Church of the Byzantine Rite. So what you have is that the Rite is typically the liturgy, and what you said is correct. It's typically the liturgy which is commonly then used for a whole lot of different churches. So it's a particular church within a particular broader rite as well. Yeah. And I think one of the things to keep in mind is that the confusions sometimes emerge because, like, if you hear the term Coptic or Armenian, now they're two examples, and there are others. They have an Orthodox counterpart as well. Whereas like two churches I just draw as an example that do not have Orthodox counterparts are the Maronites and the Chaldeans. Now, the Chaldeans is Maronites not at all, but the Chaldeans is an interesting one because there is another church which sort of sits in the middle of a no man's land, in the middle of nowhere. It's neither Catholic nor Orthodox, and it fits, and it's the Assyrian Church of the East.
First,
and it sort of sits there as one of these churches which is a solo church, which really, when you think about it, is very close to the reality of the church at the time of Jesus, and the early disciples, like these communities which would have taken and where, because clearly communities fashioned the liturgy and fashioned not belief systems, but they fashioned the way in which they lived out their beliefs according to particular local customs, rituals, etc. And again, what you had is that even was borne out in the way in which, for example, the bishops of early churches made people saints, and that type of thing. So our early origins were very orthodox in nature, in terms of, like, what you have there with the Orthodox churches is you have a great deal of I won't say democracy in a negative way.
Collegiality.
But there was a more collegial way of operating, and whereas that often has not been the case in our more contemporary church.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And again, everything we're discussing is not the faith, it's the discipline, the way of living that same faith. Like, for instance, you can go to a Roman liturgy or a Maronite liturgy or a Coptic liturgy, but what you're getting there is the same Eucharist, the same Jesus Christ, the same representation of the sacrifice, and the same theological reality and spiritual reality that you're getting at any rite of the faith, because it's the same faith, but it's expressed differently. Yeah. Now, for our listeners, I want to do a bit of a comparison. Okay, let's switch back over to the Western church so people can understand what the reality is of what these churches are. In the Western church, we have the Roman Rite, which has two forms. Contrary to modern opinion, it does have two forms. The extraordinary form, which is the traditional Latin Mass, and the ordinary form, which most Catholics use in most parishes. But then there's other rites within the Western. There's the Dominican Rite, which the Dominican order celebrates, similar to the Latin Mass. There's the Anglican use of the Anglican Ordinaria, which is such a beautiful liturgy, which is almost very similar to the Latin Mass, but in Old English. And then there's different rites like Milan, Ambrose, and those are Western rites similar to the Roman Rite. And I think that's what really opens people's minds who are Western, don't understand what the Eastern churches are. When you explain about the Latin Mass and the New Mass, they get it. Okay, two different liturgies, but it's the same faith. Okay, let's add the Anglican liturgy. Yes, that's another one. The Dominican Rite, another one. Okay, we get it now. It's just different rites which express the same faith, but in a different way, and they developed culturally, customized based on the time. And they may emphasize different theological points, but it's all the same faith. So how would you rate my description there?
Look, it's accurate. And and three of them, for example, have effectively perished in time. And they were the Celtic, like the Irish had its own rite, as you've described. The Ambrosian, which was the one of Milan, and the Mozarabic, which was in Spain. So you did have, and that's exactly correct. So in a way, there were other alternatives to what we saw in Rome and at parts in the Western Empire. And today, and again, it's about that whole understanding is, but I suppose that's where you have this interplay between the term rite, or which refers to the liturgical aspects of it, and church. Whereas, you know, when we talk about that, when we talk about a church, it's people within the Western church that, of course, that have the alternative liturgical rites that they can.
For instance, the Dominican Rite is not a self-governing church. It's just simply a liturgical rite with its calendar and breviary. That Dominicans may celebrate from time to time, but they most of the time, they celebrate the ordinary form or extraordinary form of the Roman Rite, not the Dominican Rite. So I think that opens people's minds up a bit to understand, okay, you're a Western Catholic, there's more than just one Western Rite. To open their minds at least to the fact that the church is diverse in its expression of the same faith. Is there anything you want to add to that?
No, look, I think you've described it accurately, because it's about how obviously we are each in a particular time and place, and in circumstances where we obviously see the life of the church and changes within a church within a particular context. And I think that we don't know, look, in the future, we know that one of the reasons why Pope Saint John Paul II wrote Orientale Lumen, and he wrote it in 1995, and it is the light of the East, was he had said 10 years previously about the fact that the church needed to learn to breathe with its two lungs again. Now, he was from Poland. He had experiences with many of the Byzantine Catholic churches. He was conscious of their beauty, but he was very mindful of the fact of the dangers of there being this a false understanding of the church. And in particular, he was aware of the fact that, and much of Orientale Lumen talks about the great challenges that the Eastern churches have faced in inhospitable lands, and that many of them, of course, have been martyrs. And even when you look at, as I just draw a contemporary example of this, this is not something in the back pages of history hundreds of years ago, but when we look at the ISIS destruction of Mosul, and then the current Chaldean bishop of Australia coming to Australia, having been the Archbishop of Mosul and being forced to flee that city, we see the lived reality, and it's about knowing the incredible beauty and the antiquities to which they are the bearers of a very, very, an incredibly rich heritage, and we can't be oblivious to that. And that's the great danger. One of the things that that I believe is the case is the fact that, and many would perhaps see this, like, and you made a reference to earlier the Byzantine liturgy. Now, in the Byzantine liturgy, there's an exaltation, I would call it exaltation, of the cross, as in the use of the cross is used 36 times, where people are blessed 36 times in the liturgy within that. And so you've got this heavy ritual there. But if we just take, for example, a comparison of the liturgies of the East, I will not put, for example, the Maronites into this category, though, because I would argue that the Byzantine have a liturgy which is certainly far more distinct from the Western Church than, for example, the churches of Antioch and Alexandria. Maybe no.
And I will make a confession that it is my favorite Eastern Rite.
Yeah,
especially born a Maronite, it's still the Byzantine Rite is my favorite. That I really, yeah.
And it's radically different in terms of what it offers, but just even for people to be conscious of. Whereas if I was to say, like, the Maronites themselves have become, they have always been in full communion with Rome. There is no counterpart, Orthodox counterpart. So there's been no other alternative perspective there. Now, the one thing is that you find within their practices is it probably is the most Latinized of all of the Eastern churches in its practices, whereas the Byzantines certainly aren't. And many of them, of course, do operate under even a different calendar still, and the observance of that calendar. But I would encourage people to, for example, with the liturgies of the churches of the beautiful iconostasis, which is a wall of icons, whereas they don't, they don't have statues there in their churches. They have the use of icons. The whole idea of incense and of chant, etc., and where this has gone out of. Now, it's often been described that one of the great tragedies within within any Christian faith, and it certainly is experienced within the Catholic Church, is that sometimes we have our mass. Our mass has been made devoid of the mystery, and it's about that faith really should be in adoration of the mystery of God. And I think that particularly the Byzantine Rite does achieve that very, very effectively, and where people are drawn into this. Now, I would just say people I would encourage people to do that. Whereas the one thing that I think is especially powerful, and you made a reference to this, George, earlier in your comment about Syriac and West and Eastern Syriac, virtually the same, are really the modern equivalents of Aramaic. Aramaic was the language of Jesus. And we know that effectively, by the Maronites having Western Syriac or Syriac in their liturgy, they fundamentally have parts of the Mass which really is then the words of Jesus in the Mass. Because it's the prayer, the hymn of consecration, is an incredibly powerful experience in the Maronite Mass, where the sound of that is how Jesus would have been saying it fundamentally.
Exactly. Anthony, thank you so much. Beautiful explanation there. I think you really hit the nail on the hammer. We'll take a break. A short break here now. So if you want to call in with your questions or comments, number is 96216111. That is 96216111, or simply comment in the Facebook sections or email thecatholictoolbox@gmail.com. So Stay tuned here. We'll be back shortly.
My name is Father Damon Cypher. I'm a member of the Priestly Fraternity of St. Peter, which is the Latin Mass order. Our order has been ministering to the faithful in Western Sydney for about 20 years now. But we think it's time for us to find our own place, to be able to build our own church. So we're really encouraging people to make donations, perhaps even dedicated to monthly donations, so that we can afford to take on perhaps a mortgage for this great endeavour. So we would like to, in the long term, build a traditional church for the celebration of the traditional liturgy in the Latin Rite. We would encourage you to think about this, to pray about this, and see if God is calling you to commit to helping us with this great endeavour to build a new church for Western Sydney.
Daily Meek like this.
In our modern world of today. And if you haven't got yet a copy of my book, The Art of Practical Catholicism, you can get it online through Parousia Media or any online bookstore. Just simply type it in, The Art of Practical Catholicism. You can get a copy of my book there. And I hope you enjoy it, definitely. And let's continue here. I'm so excited with this discussion particularly. But before we continue, for those who have any questions, you can simply comment in the Facebook Live feeds, or you can email us at thecatholictoolbox@gmail.com. We're available there. So we're going to continue here. We're ready. We've headed east. We simply went west for a little bit, but now we're back east. So Anthony, let's continue this great discussion. Let me summarize what you've explained here. Jesus Christ established one church outside which there are no salvation. The head is Peter, and the successors of the apostles, the rest of the 11 are the bishops. Now, these bishops or the apostles and their successors went to different places. They developed different traditions while they were there of expressing that same Catholic faith. Gave us different traditions of that same Catholic faith, different liturgies, and each of these groups sometimes developed their own cultural identity as well with the Catholic faith. And now in the church, we look at it as the 22 Catholic churches. So there's one church, which is the Western Church, which makes up most of the church. Most of the church belongs to the Western Church. But then 21 other churches are Eastern in the Catholic Church. And for those, but it's the same faith under the one shepherd of the Pope, the successor of Peter, all in communion with Rome, no matter what tradition you are expressing, but all hold to the same creed, same faith, same belief, and one communion with Peter, the successor of the apostles. But all express it differently in their liturgy and practice, and sometimes culture.
I think you've surmised it perfectly, and it's an understanding of where the fact that the similarities that sometimes many of the Eastern Catholic churches, and this has to be said, have a great deal in common that they share with their Orthodox counterparts.
Okay, now let's, for all our listeners here, so let's list some of these Eastern Catholic churches. We listed that there's two forms of the Roman Rite, the Anglican Rite, the Gallican Rite, Dominican Rite. There's many there. And if you want to if you actually want to look at it graphically, I suggest you type in Google Catholic rites or churches. And you'll get a nice diagram there. I think we might have it up here for those watching. They can look at it and look at each tradition all under one pope. But let's actually list some of these Eastern churches. Let's list some examples so people can unpack. You know, it might click to people that they met somebody who was of that particular tradition.
So if you're looking at, for example, the Chaldean Church or the Syro-Malabar churches, now they again are ones that we would associate with East Syriac, And again, they're churches that we would associate with St. Thomas the Apostle. You've got Armenian Church, Coptic, and Ethiopian. And of course, the Coptics and Ethiopians were affected by the split with the Oriental Orthodox in the 5th century. But you've got Belarusian, you've got Bulgarian, you've got Greek, you've got Melkite. So it's really your biggest collective of churches is are those that are associated with Byzantine. And that's natural as well, because the Byzantine churches are associated with St. Andrew, and especially with Constantinople. Now, Constantinople was fundamentally the capital of the eastern part of the Roman Empire, and so it was the great rival. And to remember that it was the petty rivalry between Constantinople and Rome that fueled the Great Schism of 1054. So while we do know that the filioque, and some say filioque, insertion into the creed is often seen as a defining aspect of which caused the division. A whole lot of it had to do with language. The fact that Greek had become the spoken language of Constantinople, whereas Latin was the spoken language of Rome. That Constantinople had become the great trade center instead of Rome. And so it was this power play between these two cities, which really fueled the rivalry between the churches of those two cities as well. So what you saw is that the Byzantine influence, which came out of Constantinople, then spread primarily north up into Eastern Europe largely. And that's where, because when you look at it geographically on a map, we know that Constantinople is Istanbul in modern day Turkey. And it's fundamentally, if you were to simply head north, that's where you have all of these churches were founded over time. And again, it was the expansion of the eastern part of the Roman Empire. But Greek was the primary language source of influence there. That, of course, had an impact about when you had the cultural influences, even in the ways in which people fundamentally prayed, and the way in which people's sense of about celibacy of clergy, that those positions hardened after the schism of 1054, the way in which people prayed. I mean, the way in which Roman Catholics pray today, as in bless themselves, only emerged roughly around 1076. So after the schism, whereas prior to that, people basically had blessed themselves as the Orthodox bless themselves today. So a lot of what we see had changed over time, but at the same time, one of the great lessons, I think one of the incredible things is that the documents that we have about our church today, about our history, about our culture, about our liturgy, they show us that even if we take the Mass across any of the 22 sister churches, its form has really largely stayed the same. And we have writings which go back to basically the first generation of disciples after Christ, which document the structure of the Mass.
Okay.
Anthony,
Anthony, we have a question here from Mary. Mary here is asking, would you advise Catholics to try other liturgies to find their preference? Would it not be too confusing for them to undertake their faith in this manner? So yeah, can we find our preference? Because basically we can choose, as a baptized Catholic, we can choose any rite that we want to worship according to. And Scott Hahn describes it beautifully. He says sometimes, people want to shop around for good liturgy, pick what they like. What's our attitude? Like if you're baptized, like I myself was, I have Maronite parents, but I was obviously baptized in the Latin Rite. So I didn't receive my confirmation in the, I received my confirmation at 10 years old. But I went to a Maronite school. But I found my spiritual practice not to be the Maronite liturgy, but to be the extraordinary form of the Roman Rite. But for other people, so let's say, for example, another Western Catholic or let's say a Byzantine that might like the ordinary form or another or a Syriac rite. What's our attitude to, because that's the beauty of our faith. You can attend any liturgy and fulfill your obligation and live according to any liturgy, and it's the same faith but different expression. But what should be our attitude to trying different liturgies where our preference comes in?
I'd say a couple of things. Firstly, I think we need to be always mindful of that the Mass for us is an encounter with the divine. And sometimes we have denuded the way in which the Masses can be celebrated in some places and the way in which people engage. It's almost like people are doing their best to empty the divine out of the experience. And we need to ensure that it's an encounter with what is good and true and beautiful. These need to be aesthetic experiences where people are touched by the divine, and people are also conscious of the sacred mysteries that they are participating in. And because if people had an awareness that Jesus Christ is fully present, body, blood, soul, and divinity, when we receive the Eucharist, we certainly would have no issue with reverence then. And so I would argue that our greatest challenge is to ensure that our experience of the liturgy today is meaningful and powerful, and it's a taste of heaven on earth, is what it should be. And the Mass should be the bridge between heaven and earth.
Now, finding the right, some people call it liturgical shopping, where they go and see many rites and they find one that they like. What should be the attitude?
I would in a sense, I caution with one way. And my cautionary comment would be is that many, for example, Maronites who should be worshipping in Maronite churches probably just know nothing about the Maronite liturgy and just go off to a Roman Catholic Mass. And so if we say that people shop around, the great danger for that is they may not know where to shop, and they might actually be satisfied with something which is, second best. And so I think there is a bit of a danger there.
Okay.
I would prefer to put it from the perspective of give yourself the task of experiencing a Mass in each of the 22 sister churches that belong to the Catholic Church.
And that's practical tool number one.
And I think that would be something really practical that you could do, is give yourself that opportunity to actually go to one of the masses of each of the churches. I think the key to it would be also, and the different forms of the liturgical rites that do exist within the Western Church. And so that you actually are not closed off, that you're not blind to it. Like, one of the things that I think does separate some young Australians from their level of engagement in the masses of their church is that the majority of the Eastern churches have aspects of the Mass in a native language other than the vernacular. So the vernacular in Australia is English, but we know that there are other more formal aspects of the Mass which are in, for example, Arabic, Syriac, or in other particular languages, especially in the Byzantine. So I would encourage that, but I think it's about finding opportunities for ones where to choose experiences which are very different to your normal experience. And I would also go at some of the very peak times within the church's liturgical calendar, or the very special
Holy Week,
occasions.
Yeah. Holy Week, Christmas.
And even an example of that was yesterday, the Feast of St. Anthony the Great of the Desert. Now, just one thing, like, most people consider Benedict, Saint Benedict, to be the father of monasticism. Well, technically, you would argue St. Anthony the Great of the Desert is the father of monasticism. Or you would say there are two fathers of monasticism. But you have the very beautiful ritual, which I know that they do certainly with the Lebanese Maronite order and other orders within the Eastern churches, other monastic orders, renew their vows on that day. But I would say that look for variances also. Like, liturgical seasons are not the same in each of our like, Western Church has a day of Pentecost, Maronite Church has a season of Pentecost, and you've got different aspects of it. But I would go during some of the liturgical seasons, which are high points of the calendar, and I would experience different masses at those times, but ones where you can be guaranteed of a different experience. Sacramentally, I do think I firmly believe that people should receive the sacraments in the church that they actually are a member of. I think that's important. I'm not saying it's a rejection of that church, and some people just do it for practical terms. And certainly for some of the smaller Eastern Catholic churches, some of them have very often have no priests even in this country at times.
So the practical tool that we can take here today, as we're wrapping up this show, we're running out of time here, is go and experience the other, let's say in the West, the extraordinary form, the Dominican rite, the Anglican Ordinariate rite, but go east and experience the Byzantine rite, whether it's in a Melkite church, a Ukrainian Catholic church, which we have beautifully in Lidcombe. We have several Melkite churches here around Sydney, Melkite Catholic churches, but also go try out the Maronite rite. Most Lebanese people belong to the Maronite rite. We have the Chaldeans and the Assyrian Catholics out in Bosley Park. There's Eastern Catholics around us. And what I've done personally, if I've went and visited everything that's available here in Sydney, I've put Sundays aside with a friend of mine, and we went to all of them. And with my wife, where she's experienced several rites, and we're getting there to sing every rite that we can possibly can, that are all expressions of the faith, whether it's East or West, that are under the one true shepherd. So,
and to know, and I would suggest, George, to know why there are differences, and to understand the differences.
Exactly.
You know,
Exactly.
why do some of our Eastern Catholic churches, you know, like what you find is that different parts of the mass occur at different times in some of the churches.
Exactly.
You know,
Exactly.
many of the Eastern churches start Lent on Ash Monday, not Ash Wednesday. Many of them have seasons which go for different periods of time. The Western Church has a 3-year liturgical cycle based upon Matthew, Mark, and Luke, whereas the majority of the Eastern churches have a 1-year liturgical cycle where you might have, for example, Sunday of the Good Samaritan, Sunday of the Hemorrhaging Woman, to actually know what the differences are, and that the differences are not affecting theology or belief,
exactly,
or fidelity to the Pope, etc. And but to that it's an expression of which is variant.
Anthony, thank you very much. We've run out of time here tonight. We can go on and on. We'll have to have you here for another episode. It's such a broad topic, and I love it. But thank you for your time here tonight. And
George, I will forward to you some PowerPoints, and if any of your people would like to have a look at them, they're more than welcome, because it breaks a lot of this open. Because one of the great my last comment would be, when you look at the spiritual writings of the saints of the East, they are incredible. And sometimes we actually forget. We sometimes assume, oh yeah, we don't actually, when we hear a saint's name, do we ever think, oh, I wonder what that saint's background actually was? And the spiritual writers of the East are incredible. And it's interesting to note that the first saint to be proclaimed as, and under the universal model of canonization was an Eastern Catholic, a Ukrainian, St. Josaphat, who then became the patron saint of the Second Vatican Council, because it was an ecumenical council of the church. So council, and one easy way of knowing the number of Eastern Catholics, Vatican II was the 21st ecumenical council of the church. Just as we have 21 Eastern Catholic churches. But thanks, George, and thank you to the work that you're doing.
Thank you very much for tuning into the Catholic Toolbox, the Art of Practical Catholicism. I'm your host and founder, George Manassa, here. Till next week, God bless, take care, take action.
In this era of grave spiritual crisis, it is not enough to simply know about your Catholic faith. That is why we need a Catholic toolbox to equip us with the practical skills necessary to live our Catholic faith to reach our ultimate goal, which is heaven for all eternity. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Join us every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. for the Catholic Toolbox as we hand you the tools to go forth, live the faith, and change our modern world today. Live on the Voice of Charity.